"You're coming with me," said the lonely rancher to the woman beaten for giving birth to triplet girls, Wyoming. Territory, late January 1877. High ridges of the Snow-Horn Mountains. The wind tore across the ridge like a wounded beast, its howl carrying through the trees with a force that rattled bone. Silas Greer reined in his horse, the animal's hooves crunching into the hard crust of snow. For a moment he thought the sound was only the storm. Then he heard it, thin, piercing, fragile. A cry. Not the wind. Not an animal. A baby. Silas turned his head, listening, his breath rising in clouds that froze in the night air. The cry came again, then another, overlapping, higher, weaker. His jaw tightened. He dismounted slowly, boots sinking ankle-deep into the drift, and guided his horse toward the timberline. The trail ahead was half-buried, no sign of use in days. It cut through the woods like a scar carved into the earth. The cries grew sharper the closer he came to a clearing. And then he saw her, a woman, bound to a rotted fence post with barbed wire that bit deep into her arms, her skin torn and bleeding. Snow clung to her lashes, her hair frozen in brittle strands against her pale cheeks. Bruises bloomed purple across her face. Her lips were split, cracked with cold, her breath shallow as smoke. At her feet 3 small bundles. Infants, newborns, wrapped in strips of a torn nightgown, their tiny faces nearly lost in the fabric. One whimpered weakly, another gave a faint shudder, the third lay silent as stone. The woman's head lifted, trembling, as though even the act of seeing cost her everything she had left. Her voice was barely a breath. "Don't let them take my daughters." Silas dropped to his knees beside her. He stripped off his gloves and checked the infants one by one. Cold skin, shallow breaths, fragile pulses still fighting. His throat burned with the sharp bite of winter air, but his voice came steady, low, and firm. "You're coming with me, all of you." Her eyes fluttered, slow and heavy, as if she wasn't sure she'd heard him right. Silas reached for the knife in his boot and cut through the wire. The steel tore free from her arms, peeling flesh with it. Blood welled bright against her skin, but she made no sound. Not a scream, not even a wince. Her body sagged forward, dead weight in his arms. He caught her, holding her steady, then lifted her as though she were nothing but feathers and rags. She was light, too light, the kind of weight that spoke of hunger, blood loss, and days too long in the snow. He carried her to his horse, then turned back for the infants. One by one, he gathered them close, tucking the smallest inside his coat. He pulled a thick wool blanket from the saddle and secured the others against his chest. Their warmth was faint but still there, still fighting. The wind howled, driving needles of ice into his face. His horse pawed the ground, anxious, sensing the urgency. Silas glanced toward the ridge, where the path cut back to his cabin, 1/2 a mile uphill through snowdrifts that could swallow a man whole. He adjusted his hold on the woman and the infants, murmuring into the night. "Not here, not to her, not to the babies, not on my land." Whether he spoke to the storm, to God, or to himself, he didn't know. He only knew it had to be true. With care, he mounted, holding her in front of him, the children cradled between them. Their combined weight was next to nothing, and yet he felt the burden of all their lives pressing into him. He urged the horse forward. The climb back was merciless. Snow whipped across his face, his eyes stinging, his muscles aching under the strain of holding them steady. Every step his horse took felt like one closer or one too far from salvation. He kept his head down, his grip firm, never letting himself think about failure. At last, the dark outline of the cabin broke through the storm. For walls of timber, a sloped roof sagging beneath the snow. No light, no fire. It looked small, frail, against the vast wilderness, but it was all that stood between them and death. Silas kicked the door open with his boot, carried them inside, and set the woman down on the bed of quilts near the cold hearth. The infants came next, tucked into a basket lined with rabbit pelts. He worked quickly, stoking the fire, feeding it kindling until the flames caught and filled the room with light. Only then did his hands begin to shake. Outside, the storm raged on, erasing the tracks that led to her place of torment. Inside, Silas moved with the quiet certainty of a man who had chosen. A stranger had been left to die. But not here, not on his land. The fire Silas Granger had coaxed to life burned steady now, its heat spreading out from the stone hearth, pressing the winter chill back into the corners of the cabin. The room still carried the scent of snow and blood, but warmth was returning, slowly, stubbornly. Silas moved with the quiet precision of a man who had lived too long in solitude. His soaked coat hung heavy on a peg by the fire, dripping into a tin basin. He stripped off his gloves, revealing hands split and rough, the kind that spoke of decades of labor and winters survived by grit alone. On the cot in the corner lay the woman he had dragged from the storm. She was motionless beneath a heap of wool blankets, lips tinged blue, her breath shallow and uneven. Her wrists and ankles bore fresh welts, cruel purple bruises blooming across her pale skin. Whoever had left her in the snow had meant for her to die there. But she hadn't. Not yet. Beside her, 3 infants whimpered softly, weak but alive, swaddled in tattered cloth. Their cries wavered between hunger and exhaustion. Silas crouched beside the hearth, poured goat's milk from a jug into an iron pot, and set it on the flames. From a small carved spoon and a dented tin bowl, he began preparing what little nourishment he could. When the milk cooled, he tested it against his scarred wrist, then moved to the cradle he had fashioned from a basket. One by one, he fed the babies, spoonfuls at a time, patient and careful. The smallest, a girl with a faint birthmark on her cheek, sneezed after the first sip, then latched eagerly. Silas allowed himself the faintest breath of relief. Behind him, a sound stirred from the bed, a whisper, fragile and broken. My name's Maribel. Maribel Quinn." Silas turned. In 2 strides he was beside her. He knelt, meeting her eyes. "Silas," he said simply. Her gaze drifted past him toward the children. Her lips trembled, but no sound came. Only tears, thin, silent streams that carved paths down her dirt-streaked cheeks. Her body was too tired to sob. Silas rose without a word, crossed to an old trunk, and pulled free a thick fur cloak, elk hide, lined in rabbit. He folded it and slid it beneath the basket of infants, making their rest warmer, softer. When he glanced back, Maribel was watching him. She didn't speak. Neither did he. Only a slow nod passed between them before he returned to tend the fire. Sparks leapt upward into the smoke-stained rafters like fleeting stars. Time wore on. The cabin filled with the crackle of flames, the sigh of the wind pressing against the walls, and the fragile rhythm of 4 lives refusing to surrender to the cold. Hours later, when the storm outside softened into silence, she found her voice again, hoarse, cracked, but certain. You didn't leave us." Silas didn't answer. He only sat at the hearth, eyes fixed on the fire, sharpening a hunting knife against stone with slow, deliberate strokes. The steady rasp of steel was his reply. At last, Maribel spoke again, her voice carrying the weight of years she had never been allowed to share. "I was 17 when I married Joseph Quinn. He was 34. My father called it a blessing, said Joseph's money would keep me safe. First, I thought it was true. A house with marble floors, silk dresses, feather pillows. But comfort isn't kindness." Her voice broke. She glanced at her daughters, sleeping in their makeshift cradle. "He never touched me with gentleness. And when the first girl was born, his smile vanished. With the second, he stopped speaking to me. With the third—" Her throat closed. She pressed her lips together before forcing the words out. "He called me cursed, told the midwife my womb was rotten. That night, he told his brothers I was worth less than the cattle in his fields. They beat me until I bled. And when I could not rise, he dragged me outside and tied me to the fence post." She turned her face, showing him the faint scar that curved beneath her jaw, old but undeniable. "He said if the snow claimed me, it was God's will. If not, then I was meant to live." He called it justice. Her hands trembled as she spoke. Almost without thought, one reached toward the cradle, fingers curling weakly in the air, as though she could shield her daughters even from memory itself. "They said girls are nothing but mouths to feed," she whispered. Silas's jaw clenched, a muscle ticking once. He set the knife and stone aside and crossed the room. His boots made no sound against the timber floor. He sank to one knee beside her, taking her bruised hand in his own. It was swollen, raw, the knuckles broken in places, but he held it as if it were something fragile, something sacred. Her breath caught. For the first time since she had spoken her name, her gaze steadied. His eyes, gray as winter stone, met hers with a calm that carried no judgment, no pity, only a quiet vow. The cabin fell still. The storm outside might rise again, but within those four walls, something had shifted. For the first time in years, Maribel Quinn was not alone. The silence stretched, heavy but steady. Then, finally, his voice cut through it, low, certain, unshakable. "Silas, your girls. They're the only thing worth feeding." Maribel's eyes filled at once. This time, she didn't hold back, didn't swallow them like she always had. The tears came freely, tracing paths down her cheeks, catching the glow of the firelight. They mingled with the soft breaths of her daughters, the only lullaby the cabin knew. Silas stayed there beside her, still kneeling, his calloused hand wrapped around hers. He didn't press, didn't preach, didn't need to. His presence was enough, grounded, solid, immovable. Outside, snow drifted in soft sheets from the dark sky, piling against the cabin walls. Inside, though, something shifted. Not warmth exactly, but something deeper. A seed, the fragile start of a promise neither dared name. The thaw came slow. Snow sloughed off the eaves in slushy rivulets, the drifts darkening into wet gray mounds. Patches of frozen earth showed through like old scars on the mountainside. The long sleep of winter was breaking, but spring carried more than birdsong and buds. Carried word from below. The knock came just after dawn. Silas swung open the door. A woman stood bundled in a green wool shawl, breath clouding in the cold. Her cheeks were flushed raw from the ride, and behind her, a horse twitched and stamped, still lathered from the climb. "Morning, Hattie." "Silas, it's about her." Maribel sat near the hearth, one of the babies tucked against her chest. Hattie's glance flicked toward her, brief but telling, before she fixed her eyes back on Silas. "Joseph Quinn's put out word. Says she ran off in some fit. Calls her unstable. Says the babies are his by right, that she's keepin' them in secret against the law." Maribel froze, fingers tightening around her daughter. "He's hired men. 4 of 'em. Claims they just mean to fetch a mother back where she belongs. But I know that look in a man's eyes. This ain't no rescue party." Silas's jaw flexed. He gave one sharp nod, nothing more. That was all Hattie needed. She pulled a small leather pouch from her coat and pressed it into his hand. Dried lentils, strips of jerky, a flask of spirits. "You'll need it." Her eyes lingered, a question she didn't ask. Then she turned, mounted, and rode back down the trail. The rest of the day moved like a storm, quiet, tense, full of purpose. Silas reinforced the door with a second crossbar, repaired the back window latch, stacked firewood high near the hearth so Maribel wouldn't need to step outside. He shifted supplies to the root cellar, a dark hiding place if it came to that. He didn't talk. He didn't need to. The scrape of his blade against the whetstone said enough. He sharpened his hunting knife until its edge shone like silver, then slid it into its sheath and wore it close. That night, sleep came light and brittle. They woke at every creak of the trees. Morning broke strange. The air too still, the forest holding its breath. Even the birds had gone silent. Then came the sound, hooves, 4 of them. Maribel's arms wrapped tight around her daughters. Silas opened the cabin door and stepped outside. 4 riders drew up, slow, deliberate. Wide-brimmed hats shadowed their faces. Their horses snorted, restless. The leader had a scar cleaving his cheek and a revolver hanging loose at his hip. "Silas Granger, we come with claim." Silas said nothing. "That woman inside belongs to Joseph Quinn. She's his property. By law, those girls are his too. We've got every right to take 'em back." Silas stood on the threshold, arms loose at his sides. No gun in his hands. No fear in his eyes. His voice came calm, even. "She was never his. And she sure as hell ain't yours." A sneer curled the man's mouth. "You think this is over, mountain man?" Silas didn't blink. "You want to test that? Come back. Try." Silence. For sets of eyes fixed on him, measuring, weighing. The moment stretched thin as a bowstring. Then, finally, the leader jerked his reins. "Not today." They wheeled their horses. Snow sprayed under hooves. The riders vanished into the tree-lean, but their eyes had carried a promise. Silas stood at the threshold long after they were gone. Inside, Maribel finally exhaled. Heart thundering, daughters clutched to her chest. Safe for now. But shadows from the lowlands would rise again. Spring unfolded slow and reluctant. Snow peeled back to reveal shoots of green. Branches budded. The days stretched longer. The cabin softened with the season. What once felt like a shelter against death began to take on the shape of a home. Maribel no longer moved like a hunted thing. Her steps steadied. She no longer flinched at the crack of the fire or the howl of wine down the chimney. She learned to make small meals with what little they had. Stews of pine roots, wild onions, mushrooms Silas foraged. Rabbit when luck struck, grouse most often. The babies, Eloise, Ruth, and June, thrived. Their cheeks plumped with life. Their cries grew sharper, then sweeter, like birds testing new voices. They slept in a row of makeshift nests. Coyote pelts and straw, lined with scraps of quilt Silas had kept folded for years, and used until now. Mornings were the gentlest. Maribel woke before dawn, stirred the coals, checked the girls. Silas would already be gone, off setting traps or hunting. He left no notes. He never had to. He always came back. Their words stayed few. Not cold, not distant, just simple. They were learning a different language, one built in silence, in gestures, in steady presence. Neither asked about the past. Neither spoke of it. Those words were buried deep, like bones under frost. There was no undoing what had been done. There was only surviving what remained. Still, small comforts rooted themselves. One afternoon, Maribel found him outside at the workbench. His coat lay discarded. His sleeves were rolled, forearms browned and strong from years of labor. A cedar plank rested under his hands. He carved with slow precision, knife shaving curl after curl of wood. He didn't look up, but he knew she was there. That night she saw what he had made. 3 wooden plaques, no larger than his hand, hung above the baby's resting place. Each bore a name, carved neat and smooth, the wood polished until the firelight gleamed across the letters. Each stroke deliberates, each name honored. Maribel pressed trembling fingers to her lips, swallowing the sob that threatened to escape. No one, not her kin, not even her late husband, had ever carved her daughter's names into anything lasting. Yet here, in the quiet refuge of this mountain cabin, they hung carved into wood above the hearth. Not as property, not as claims, as prayers, as proof that her girls had a place in this world. The days stretched warm, painted in shades of green and gold. In the evenings, Maribel sang to the girls, soft lullabies she barely remembered, songs her mother once hummed while braiding her hair beneath the summer sun. The melodies had grown faint over the years, but now they returned, carrying comfort. Silas sat by the doorway most nights, his tall frame leaning against the wooden jamb. He would polish his rifle, mend harness straps, or sharpen tools, but always listening, always near. One evening, the air shifted. A storm gathered far off in the peaks, and the scent of wet earth and pine drifted through the cabin. Maribel stirred a pot over the fire, humming low. Silas sat at the table, working rabbit pelts with his calloused hands. She hadn't planned to say it. The words slipped free before she could stop them. Silas Granger. The full weight of his name. The room stilled. His hands froze mid-motion. Slowly, he turned, firelight catching in his eyes, glowing like embers awaiting breath. He didn't answer at once. He only looked at her, as though hearing his name from her lips had shifted something inside him forever. Maribel turned too, meeting his gaze with a steadiness she hadn't carried in years. "I never said thank you," she whispered. "Not properly." Silas rose, quiet as always, and stepped closer. He didn't touch her. Instead, his eyes flicked to the bubbling pot, to the girls sleeping by the fire, and then back to her. "You didn't need to," he said. The silence that followed was not empty. It brimmed with unspoken truths, heavy with things that lived in the air between them. A silence of beginnings. Maribel smiled, faint but sure. Not a smile of finality, but of first steps. And Silas, who rarely spoke more than a handful of words a day, nodded once and returned to his seat. Outside, the wind stirred. Rain had not yet fallen, but it would. Inside, the quiet felt like peace. The storm came hard. Not rain, but snow. Rolling fast across the mountain, tearing the sky white with fury. Wind screamed through the trees. Snow slashed sideways against the cabin walls, erasing tracks within minutes. Inside, the fire crackled and the shutters rattled. Silas checked the latches with steady precision. Maribel gathered Ruth and June in her arms, Eloise asleep beside the fire, too young to notice the fear tightening the room. Then Silas froze. He brushed frost from the window pane and peered into the storm. Shapes emerged, 3 riders, cloaked against the wind, forcing their way up the trail. Deliberate, possessive. "It's them," Silas murmured. Maribel's breath caught. She didn't need to ask. One look at him told her all she needed to know. Joseph had found them. Silas turned, voice sharp, urgent. "Take the girls. Follow the creek. Stay low. Don't stop. Don't come back, unless it's with law." Her eyes widened. "But you—" He was already moving. He pulled down the elk fur cloak, wrapped it around her shoulders, and pressed dried meat, apples, and a flask into her satchel. Then he drew a small blade, no longer than her hand, and pressed it into her palm. "Keep it close. If they catch you, don't hesitate." Her lips trembled. "What about you?" "I'll lead them away." Before she could speak again, he kissed Eloise's forehead and looked at her one last time. "Go. Now." With tears burning, Maribel bundled the girls, 2 in her arms, 1 tied to her back, and vanished into the storm. Silas shut the door behind her, exhaling once before he went to work. He tied a spare coat to a fence post near the southern trail, rigged a lantern behind a log to cast false shadows, and tethered his horse down the slope as though abandoned in flight. A decoy fire smoldered just beyond the bend, smoke curling into the storm. Every trap meant to confuse, every moment bought for her escape. Then he returned to the cabin and waited. The knock came sharp, violent. Silas opened the door to 3 men, snow-caked and grim. At their front stood Joseph Quinn, still polished, still handsome in that sharp, merciless way, his eyes colder than the storm behind him. "She took what's mine," Joseph said, voice cutting through the blizzard. "The girls carry my name." Silas stepped onto the porch, closing the door behind him. "You came this far for lies?" Joseph's lip curled. "I came for blood. She belongs to me. She belongs to herself." The words struck like iron. Joseph's jaw twitched. He drew a pistol. "Last chance, Stoker." Silas stood tall, unarmed, unmoved. "You'll have to shoot me." One of Joseph's men lunged forward, rifle swinging. The blow caught Silas across the shoulder. He staggered, hit the doorframe, fell to one knee, snow soaking crimson at his side. Joseph leveled his gun. "Drop it." The command cut through the storm. A lantern swayed in the treeline. Sheriff Mather rode into view, flanked by deputies, rifles drawn. Joseph turned just in time to see Maribel step out of the woods, cloak torn, snow streaking her hair, eyes hard with fire. "Tell them what you did," she said, voice unwavering. "Or I will." The sheriff's horse stamped the snow. "Arrest him." Joseph's weapon fell. His protests crumbled into disbelief as deputies bound him and his men, dragging them away into the storm. Maribel rushed to Silas. He slumped against the door, blood dripping into the snow. "You're not dying," she whispered fiercely, pressing her hand to his wound. He grunted through the pain, lips curling in the faintest smile. "Wasn't planning on it." "Good," she said, voice breaking but steady. "Because I won't bury the only man who stood between us and hell." His eyes softened despite the blood, the storm, the ache. "Knew you'd come back." Spring came gentle. The snow melted into wildflowers. Robins perched in the pines. Wounds healed, some on skin, some deeper. Silas's shoulder mended under Maribel's steady hands. Her touch firm, careful, never fussy. Together they rebuilt the cabin. Not just wood and nails, but trust, belonging, and the fragile beginning of something new. The storm had tried to break them, but here they stood, still breathing, still building, still theirs. What had once been nothing more than a battered shelter for survival was slowly becoming something far greater, a home. Silas extended the east wall to make space for a larger hearth, a fire big enough to warm more than just bones. Maribel painted the shutters a faded green, using the last of a pigment Tin Hattie had carried all the way from town. With each touch of care, the cabin shed its scars and began to breathe like a place meant for living, not merely enduring. Before long, they made a choice. The doors that had once been locked tight against the cold and the world were now open to travelers. Men rode the trade trail in every season. Fur traders, timber haulers, drifters, and ranch hands drifting between counties. Word spread in whispers and then in certainty. Near the ridge, just below the second switchback, there was food, fire, and a safe bed. They called it the hearth at Granger Ridge. Maribel cooked meals that filled both belly and spirit, venison stew, root vegetable hash, and sweet cornbread drizzled with honey. Silas kept the place secure. Hunting, chopping wood, tending the stables, and making sure no trouble ever dared cross their porch. The three girls grew fast, as children do. Eloise walked first, sturdy and sure. Ruth's first word was fire. June sang before she ever learned to speak. Their laughter drifted through the walls and lingered in the rafters until even silence itself seemed gentler. One evening, when the last rider had gone and the girls lay asleep, Maribel stepped outside. She found Silas sanding down a rough plank of wood, his shoulders catching the moonlight. He looked up, set the board aside, and reached into a satchel. From it he pulled a thick, hand-woven shawl, dyed a deep burgundy, embroidered with dark thread. On one corner, stitched carefully, were three initials, E.R.J., and beneath them, in block letters, a single word, worthy. Maribel's breath caught. She ran her fingers across the thread, her voice breaking into a whisper. "You made this." Silas nodded once. "For you. Because you are." She pressed the shawl to her chest, swallowing hard. After a long pause, heavy but full, she whispered back, "You chose us, when you could have walked away." Silas did not answer with words. He stepped forward, took her hand in his calloused one, and looked into her eyes. There was no grand proposal, no polished declaration. Just a vow, spoken in the stillness of two souls who had already chosen. That night, as firelight danced against the log walls, they exchanged their promises. No gold rings, no priest, no crowd. Just voices soft as prayer and hearts steady as stone. Silas gave Maribel a string of carved wooden beads, polished smooth and tied with twine. One bead for each daughter. He looped them around their tiny wrists as they slept. And for Maribel, he offered nothing but his hand. She took it, and in doing so, she took everything. Spring came to the ridge in full bloom. The snow melted into rushing streams. Moss spread soft beneath the stones. Wild violets curled along the path to the cabin. The air carried the mingling scent of pine, wood smoke, wild herbs, and fresh bread rising in the hearth. Children's laughter spilled into the yard. Eloise, Ruth, and June tumbled barefoot across the porch steps, their dresses stained with grass and sunlight. Their hair, sun-warmed and unruly, flew like banners behind them. The hearth at Granger Ridge had become more than a refuge. It was a story whispered among riders and traders, a quiet legend. Travelers didn't just climb the switchback for food and shelter. They came for peace, for the rare feeling of belonging, even if only for a night. Inside, men and women sat at the rough-hewn table, steaming mugs of pine tea in hand, while the girls' laughter carried through the walls. Maribel served with quiet grace, often tucking an extra roll or sweet into a traveler's pocket before they left, as if to send them onward with a piece of home. Silas worked the land with steady patience, carving garden rows from rocky earth, potatoes, carrots, squash, beans. When the girls napped, Maribel gathered the neighborhood children, teaching them letters with nothing but chalkboard and charcoal. Some walked 5 miles for her lessons. Others lingered long after the last word faded, just to hear her sing. Every night, without fail, the hearth fire was lit, not out of fear of the cold, but because once you've known its bite, you never forget. Fire, to them, was not just warmth. It was memory. One evening, Silas sat on the porch steps, boots dusted with soil, a basket of green beans beside him. The sun melted into the hills, casting the whole ridge in molten gold. Maribel joined him, carrying 2 mugs of tea. She settled at his side. The girls darted barefoot in the yard, shrieking with laughter. Maribel handed him his mug, her hand brushing against his. He curled his fingers beneath hers. She watched their daughters chase the falling light, then turned to him, her voice low and steady. "This fire between us," she said. "It never went out." Silas's eyes narrowed against the sun, his smile faint but sure. It just needed a place to live. They sat like that for a long while, hand in hand, as dusk softened into lavender and the first stars trembled awake. Anyone passing by would never know the whole story. The blood and the storms, the fear, the nights nearly broken. But they would see the way she smiled, the way he watched her, the way 3 little girls danced barefoot in mountain sunlight. And they would understand that something rare had been built here, not from wealth, not from conquest, but from the stubborn, beautiful kind of love that survives the cruelest winters and stays. And so, the hearth at Granger Ridge lived on, not as a building but as a promise. Thank you for riding with us through this tale of fire, frost, and a love that refused to fade. In a land where justice was scarce and warmth even scarcer, Silas and Maribel proved that sometimes the strongest homes are built not of stone or timber, but of trust, sacrifice, and the choice to remain when leaving would be easier. Spring had fully claimed the mountain now. The snow was long gone from the ridge, replaced by soft moss and wild violets curling along the stone path that led up to the cabin. The sharp bite of winter had given way to gentler scents, pine and wood smoke, wild herbs, and fresh bread baking in the hearth. Children's laughter carried across the yard like music. Eloise, Ruth, and June chased each other around the porch steps, their dresses stained with grass and joy, their hair wild and sun-warmed as it bounced in the fading light. From the kitchen window, Maribel watched with a smile soft as the flour dusting her hands. The hearth at Granger Ridge had grown into more than a refuge. It had become a stopping place, a quiet legend among riders and traders. Travelers climbed the switchback trail not only for food but for peace, something that felt like home, if only for a single night. They sat at the rough-hewn table with steaming mugs of pine tea, listening to the laughter outside. Maribel served with quiet grace, sometimes slipping a warm roll into a rider's coat pocket for the road ahead. Silas stayed mostly out back, working the rows of potatoes, beans, and squash he had carved into the stubborn soil with his own hands. When the girls napped, Maribel gathered local children and taught them their letters with chalk and charcoal. Some walked 5 miles for a lesson. Others stayed long after the letters had faded, just to hear her sing. Every evening, the fire in the hearth was lit with care, not because they feared the cold anymore, but because they remembered it too well to forget. One evening, after the last guest had gone, Silas sat on the porch steps, boots dusted with earth, a basket of green beans at his side. The sun sank low, painting the world in gold. Maribel stepped out with 2 mugs in hand and sat beside him. Their daughters darted barefoot through the yard, laughter ringing like bells. She passed him a mug, then rested her hand lightly on his. His fingers curled beneath hers. Together they watched their girls running wild in the fading light. After a while, Maribel spoke softly. "This fire between us, it never went out." Silas's eyes stayed on the horizon, where the sky burned into lavender and rose. The corners of his eyes crinkled. It just needed a place to live. And so they sat, hand in hand, as the first stars pierced the dusk. No traveler passing by would ever know the full story, not the blood and storm, the fear and the fight. But they would see the way she smiled, the way he watched her, and the way three little girls danced in the glow of a mountain evening, and they would understand. Something powerful had been built here, not from wealth, not from war, but from trust, from sacrifice, and from the kind of stubborn, beautiful love that outlasts even the harshest winter. Thank you for riding with us through this tale of fire, frost, and a love that refused to fade. In a land where justice was scarce and warmth rarer still, Silas and Maribel proved one truth worth carrying forward. The strongest homes are not built of timber or stone. They are built of choice, the daily choice to stand, to endure, to keep the fire alive. And so, as you leave this story and ride toward your own horizon, may your fires burn steady, may your nights know peace, and may someone always choose to stand beside you, in the storm and in the quiet. Until next time, may your fires burn steady, and may someone always choose to stand beside you in the quiet.